What is a self, and how do you fix it if it's broken? Forgive me if I have to cover a bit of philosophic ground, but I think we need to start by answering that one basic question. And just for the added challenge to help illustrate this theory, I'm going to explain 8 of the most difficult to understand responses often seen in borderline personality disorder and other disorders of emotional dysregulation. Hopefully by the end you'll be able to intuitively understand why some of these behaviors happen. What started off as one is now going to be at least 3 videos on this subject. I think I bit off a bit more than I can chew, mainly because I want to be really thorough. I'm adding a few concepts, so here's my updated bibliography. After speaking with several professional counselors about part 1 of my borderline series, I actually got requests to talk about certain things, particularly those behaviors that are difficult to understand or frustrating to deal with, and how they can have positive aspects. Obviously, if we don't understand why something's happening and the purpose it serves for the individual, interacting with them becomes much more difficult. But then I realized I can simply use that question as a jumping off point to describe my theories, and I've tended to think of borderline as a doorway to the greatest questions of what does it mean to be human? What is the human being? So then I realized I can explain my theories while giving some practical value. So I'm going to present this lecture as a response to some of the questions presented by 2 of the therapists I spoke to. So we made a list of 8 things that are often seen in borderline, although they're not just borderline, but things that are difficult to know how to respond to or why they happen at all, and explain them in an order that lets you understand how we develop our sense of self and what happens when it's broken. What does that look like? So there will be some philosophy and jargon here, but I'm hoping to use enough analogies and demonstrations that it'll be fine for a general audience. I am going to review part 1, but only review. If you've missed that episode, you need to go back and watch that first. Now in this video, I want to help everyone understand intuitively what it's like to be a borderline person, especially if you are a borderline person. I've come to realize what a daunting task this is as I started to sort through how many different philosophic and theoretical concepts you have to get. But I feel like I have an intuitive understanding, so I'm really hoping I can pass that on. Mainly because people are so much more likely to get frustrated and give up just because they don't get the results or responses that they expect. So in this video, I'm hoping I can both teach you how to predict and understand what's going on in these interactions. I know it's kind of backwards, but I'm actually going to save the diagnostic criteria for the next video where I'm going to present it along with the treatment model. I promise you're going to be amazed at how the theory and practice come together at once, or your money back. Since not many people watch to the end, if there was only one thing I can pass on to you as a person either suffering with mental health disorders or even a professional working with someone with mental health disorders, it's this one analogy. And yes, The Simpsons did it first. In some episode, I guess Homer knocked down Flanders' house and everyone felt bad for him since he was now homeless. So the entire town came together in a beautiful moment, all worked like the Amish and rebuilt his house together in one day. They bring him home for an unveiling and he sees his newly constructed house. Oh my dilly goodness, or whatever he says. He's the happiest man in town. The house looks new and perfect from the outside. Everything is just so amazing. Let's go in and have a look. Now, stepping inside, things are suddenly not the same as they seemed like outside. Some of the doorways are a little lopsided, the stairs seem crooked. They wander into the kitchen and Flanders says, "Has that always been there?" looking down at a toilet sitting right beside his refrigerator. Chief Wiggums replies, "No, but it's pretty hard to get one of those things up a flight of stairs." Bart decides to show the boys their room, and as they wander in, there's a giant picture of Krusty the Clown on the wall. Not to mention that the house seems to be held together by nothing but spit, gum, and baling wire. But one of the boys says, "You know, I don't like Krusty the Clown." So he tries to take the poster down. Bart jumps over, "No, don't," but it's too late. The poster is removed, and the ceiling collapses. That was a weight-bearing poster. Now, I know the term strength-based treatment has been thrown around a whole lot as a new buzzword. But I've always had this approach to some degree. I'm not even sure if it's strength-based. I'm just constantly thinking about the function of a behavior or a problem. Because every good thing has a problem that comes with it. And every problem has something good and useful about it. As long as it doesn't kill you. Thank you, Nietzsche. But if I start getting to know somebody, it may be like wandering into their house. I may not be trying to be judgmental. I may be trying to be very helpful. But if I say, "Let me help you clean this place up," and, "Oh my goodness, there's a post in the middle of that door. People keep stubbing their toes. We need to get rid of that post." Well, if I don't consider why the post is there, and I just take a sledgehammer to it, then, just like The Simpsons, the ceiling's going to collapse on me. And yes, I just stepped on the toes of a lot of bad CBT practitioners. Just because something's not as functional as it could be doesn't mean it's not functional in some way. The townspeople putting together Flanders' house weren't professional builders. They were just volunteers, and they did the best they could. Was it great? No. But it was a house. Well, unless it collapses. But you can only work with what you got. If you want to remove that post, first figure out where else you can put supports. What other skills can you build? What things can you give this person that they can use instead of that post? Once you've built in new supports, once you've developed skills and they have other means of meeting that same need, then you can think about taking the post down. And in fact, the person will probably get rid of it all on their own. It's not necessary. Why would it be there? As you listen to all these different things I'm going to tell you about borderline, I want you to keep that picture in mind. When you hear about some crazy behavior or reaction you don't understand, I'm going to say that's a failure of your understanding. And that doesn't have to mean that every behavior is okay or that we should just accept things. No, not at all. Some actions may be very self-destructive, but that doesn't mean they have no value or that it can't be useful to help you get a good picture of how this person has built their whole life. I'm going to give you a couple of theoretical tools here that you can use to try to develop a concept of what that behavior may be doing, why these things exist, and why they may have helped the person in the past. So you got that? We're not just going to take a sledgehammer to things. We're going to understand them first. We're not going to just be judgmental and say, hey, that doesn't make sense. We're going to understand them first, right? So let's jump back in. So the problem with reviewing part 1 is that once I summarize it, you may decide that you understand it entirely, but actually don't. It's not just a philosophic idea that you can comprehend with your left brain. You actually have to experience it over time with your right brain so it can sink in and so that you can use it with your whole brain, which is one of the reasons I decided to make that a standalone video so it would have time to be absorbed. So even if you have already seen the first one, you may want to go back and watch it again just so you can keep the full picture in mind. I'm going to be building on it quite a bit, and a shaky foundation leads to a shaky building.
Oh, shoot.
Also, let me briefly repeat my previous disclaimers. If you or someone you know thinks you may have borderline personality disorder, I really do suggest treatment by a professional, particularly someone who's comfortable working with this population. And actually, part of my goal of this series is to make people more comfortable with borderlines. But I also realize if someone else refuses to get treatment or refuses to recognize they have a problem, there's almost nothing you can do in that situation to improve their condition. This actually has nothing to do with borderline itself, but anyone just living your life, interacting with people, interacting with borderlines, or if you are borderline, blame just isn't a helpful way of dealing with the world. And that's blaming others or yourself. It's useless, it's sticky, it's gross. It makes people want to avoid responsibility rather than taking responsibility. And that's really the goal. Even when it is the case that someone else is at fault, the extent to which you say they have to change is the exact amount of control you're giving away. All of us only have limited control of our own lives, so why would you think it's going to be very successful to try to control someone else's? But you can improve the way you interact with them. So I'm thinking both in terms of helping borderline people understand themselves as well as providing some resources and skills for other people, be that professional or personal, to respond to them better. Now that that's out of the way, in our last very special episode of Punky Brewster, we discovered that the brain has two independently functioning parts and opposites don't always attract. Although they may want to cooperate, wacky hijinks ensue when they try to catch each other's errors. But that's what they're made to do, cause two brains are better than one. Now yes, I'll put in the addendum here that I do recognize that any division of the brain into different parts is actually fraught with errors. There are multiple things going on in all parts of the brain. So this analogy isn't perfect, but it's close enough to be useful. It's in the ballpark. Let's call it a ballpark fact. So the left hemisphere is the stodgy old man. He does things logically and in order. He takes his time and makes a plan. Now the right hemisphere is the source of emotions, and sometimes it might seem like chasing a child around that you can't quite control, but it's deceptively intelligent. The right hemisphere looks at your current situation and compares that to all the patterns in your life, your entire history. Then it prepares your body for whatever activity it thinks you might have to do, while also directing your logical mind and your attention to the things it thinks are important for this current situation. The problem is, the left hemisphere can't always tell what information it's getting from the right, because the right brain only communicates what it knows by emotions. We're used to recognizing that sometimes your emotions are wrong and your thinking brain is right. But sometimes it's the other way around, and your thinking brain is wrong and your emotions are right. The point is to teach them to cooperate so we can tell the difference, so we can use all the information at our disposal. So now let's expand on that a little bit. What are those emotions? We talked last time about how they were pattern recognition. We recognize the patterns of life, but there are a few other words I could use to describe it. The simplest being the story. It's the story of where you came from, where you are now, and where you're going. That's the pattern of your life, and really, that represents your sense of self. It's your personality trajectory, the direction you've been thrown along, and that with work you can redirect. Now, I've mentioned I don't like the idea of personality disorders, and I don't like the idea of personality organizations either. All of this seems more static than we really are. We're living beings. We move, we change, we adapt. When people define personality, they say relatively stable traits that follow you your whole life. But really, it's this repeated pattern of the ways we choose to interact with the world that is our sense of self. And dramatic or traumatic or other major events can change that trajectory. And that trajectory is our personality. So I don't want you to think of it as if it's carved in stone. Again, I call it trajectory because I want you to think of it more as Newtonian physics. An object in motion tends to stay in motion unless it's acted upon by another force. And I want you to be that force, whether for yourself or someone else. But actually, there's a lot involved in that statement, so let's get into it. In the last video, I said I was going to start with the work of Russell Mears, who's been my favorite researcher on the topic, and I believe I hinted at the idea that his theory is that borderline is a dissociation from your sense of self. He backed this up with neurobiology, but I realized if I want to explain this well, I'm going to have to start somewhere else entirely, with another favorite of mine, Joseph Zinker. I started by reading some Fritz Perls, but following that, this book was my first serious introduction to what I believe is the only real philosophic movement inside psychology. Sorry, Viktor Frankl. Yeah, you almost made it. Zinker had a really interesting description of 7 stages of contact, which I just boiled down to about 4, which I think are much easier to understand. There are several really good things in that book that relate to this discussion, but I'm going to use it to talk about contact and closure. By contact, I mean thinking about touching any interaction with anything, internal or external. And closure is the completion of that interaction. Don't worry, I'm going to give lots of examples as we go, starting with baby's first story. I, as a baby, have some unpleasant feeling. I've not yet even learned how to identify what feeling I am having. I respond the only way a baby can and alert my parents. The parent comes, figures out what's going wrong, and hopefully resolves the situation. From this, I learn that I can get help from the external world, and that there is an external world that I have some amount of ability to control. Repeat that day after day, and you start developing a sense of what the universe is like and what you can expect from it. Only, what if my parent is inconsistent and doesn't always provide what I need, or doesn't always interpret my needs correctly? Well, some amounts of that won't matter, because the trajectory and the force are always pushing me in the same direction. But if there's a significant interruption, my trajectory may be pushed in unhelpful ways, or perhaps I have inconsistent expectations because it's an inconsistent world. But baby's first story really only has 4 parts: want, get, use, and closure. I say closure, it could be enjoy, or it could be relief from suffering. It could be all kinds of things. It's a bit vague, so I'll help you work it out. Right now, my 4 shapes are going to recognize each part of that pattern. And for the baby, it's pretty simple. Want food, access mom, eat food, enjoy. In fact, this pattern may seem too simple to even be worth pointing out, but there's a whole lot going on here, and it's definitely worth a closer look. We're going to take that well-adjusted baby, fast forward 35 years, and we'll look at the same process while talking about obesity in American office workers. So now that the baby is an adult, he can obviously recognize when he's hungry. He knows to go get food. He has access to money and resources, so that's not a problem. He can make a food purchase. He's a smart guy, so he finally decided to kick that horrible meth habit, so he still has all his teeth, and therefore eats the food. But since he has 70-hour work weeks, he doesn't have time to sit and enjoy the food, or really pay attention to eating it at all. It's basically inhaled while he slaves away at some very important project. So the final stage, enjoyment, completion, is left out. Just as I mentioned about the baby who has inconsistent responses from his or her mother, it doesn't matter if you skip any of those steps, occasionally. But if it's a pattern, that's a different thing. If it becomes the dominant pattern, then it comes to be what I expect from my experience of eating. Day after day, I fail to pay attention to the completion of the process of eating, and therefore, I never really turn off those alarm bells that tell me I'm hungry. And as the alarm bells keep going, I continue to think I'm hungry, and I continue to eat. And if I continue to eat without paying attention, then I continue to have the alarm bells go off. This is what happens when you fail to get closure to any kind of process of contact. Anything you think about, touch, or experience, internally or externally, it has to have that recognition of completion, that attention drawn to the finish point, the feeling of success, the lesson learned. Or you never turn off that desire to have the experience in the first place, or the alarm that went off to inform you that there was something that you needed, because the experience is never finished. So in the case of hunger, hunger is a warning bell, and if the bell doesn't turn off, perhaps it even gets louder. Suddenly I become insatiable, perhaps even an addict. For a non-physical example, what if I grew up with a mother who hates me because I remind her of her loser husband that walked out on her? Through no fault of my own, I can never get access to the feeling of being loved. I want it. I get access to my mother. I try to use the mother in a sense of getting love, but I am then rejected. So I go back and try to start the cycle over and try harder, try to do something different, assume that it's something wrong with me. And thus begins a cycle I may engage in my entire life, always trying to finish this pattern, always trying to complete this story, even in situations that are entirely unrelated. So what happens when the cycle starts being blocked more than it should be? Again, this is my hybrid version of Zinker, but consider, if you get blocked between wanting and getting, Then you're going to become frustrated, and frustration's supposed to make you act out so you can get the things you need. Too often we think of frustration as a bad reaction because we think of children who have to have their desires tempered and directed, but they still get to finish their needs. They get to complete a cycle, just not in maybe the way that they wanted to, or not as quickly as they wanted to. They fill their basic needs in appropriate ways. But what if you have basic needs that don't ever get fulfilled? I hate it when adults just complain about children wanting attention. Yes, attention is a basic human need. That doesn't mean they get it all the time. That doesn't mean they get it on their terms all the time. But attention is the simplest version of love, although I suppose I'm wandering off on a tangent. Now, if you get blocked between getting and using, well, then you're going to think there's something wrong with me. I have this thing. Why can't I use it? And then you're going to act in, becoming really anxious and always second-guessing yourself or your ability to handle a situation. But if you get blocked between using and that sense of completion, well, then you're going to act out again. You're going to never feel complete, never feel satisfied. But the worst situation is the one I just described, where you're constantly rejected and have to start the game over again. And that's the kind of thing that can start a downward spiral. It can become a serious problem if you keep getting sent back to go and have to start over with your wants. If you do that enough, then you start asking yourself, should I want this? Maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I don't even deserve to want this. This can result in a spiral of shame. And then serious depression starts as you begin to act in. You start to attack the whole concept of your place in the world. And what if it's not just a blockage with your ability to feel full with food, or even a very significant one like being able to access love? What if it's multiple blockages across several different areas, some of them acting in, some of them acting out, and you can never form a consistent picture of what you're supposed to do in the world to get the things you need? Many studies have shown a connection between an invalidating childhood environment and the development of borderline personality disorder, but the main takeaway there is the invalidation. I'm supposed to trust that the adults in charge know more about the world and that they're trying to help me understand the world. But if I'm constantly invalidated, then I may never learn to trust myself and my own experiences. And I don't mean that in the sense that we should blindly trust our experiences. We should learn how to trust our experiences and learn when they're probably correct or when we should trust others. That doesn't happen if we're always told we're wrong and always told to trust others, especially if we're told to trust the experiences of people who are unsafe or who we know are inaccurate in their perceptions. If the child doesn't have a consistent picture of what they should be learning from a situation, or if the adult is telling me one thing and I know something else to be the truth, how do I reconcile that difference? And if I can't reconcile that difference, then can I even understand what's going on? And if I don't understand, I'm not going to get closure. Suddenly, there are a million little events, a million stories that make up my life that should be closed, that should have lessons that I have learned from them, but they're all open. They all make no sense, and they're all happening right now in this moment, even though they may have been 20 years ago. Add to that a little bit of trauma, and that some of those open events may be sirens that are screaming warnings at you all the time, and it really becomes more surprising that a person like that can react well to anything. A little bit of a tribute to the human spirit. So wanting, getting, using, completing, those 4 pieces over your entire life, this becomes your sense of self. This becomes your trajectory and the way you see the story of your life. These patterns you've experienced about how to get the things you need and the most effective ways to do that. Hopefully each of those 4 blend together with other experiences of the same type, and then they all come together into one coherent picture. That becomes your sense of self. So again, what do you do when your sense of self is broken? And it's not like the kind of thing you can just repair. It's more like being unanchored on the ocean. It's a cloudy night with not a star in the sky, and you have no reference points to get your direction, to know where you are or where you're going. You don't have a grounding to even figure out how to solve the problems. If you didn't get completion and a good sense of closure for all your own stories, then you can't look back into the past and say, how did I solve that problem before? I should use that answer now. If my experience of the past was mostly chaotic and unintelligible, then all I can do is create more chaos and unintelligibility. So now that we have a good picture of what the self is, let's talk about what happens when it's damaged. What does that look like? So back to Russell Mears, he defines borderline as a dissociation from your sense of self. And for review, dissociation is not being able to think about something. It can be as simple as a habit of ignoring something, to absent-mindedly not recognizing what's going on, all the way to repressed memories. So dissociation is just blocking something from your attention, either intentionally or not intentionally. A simple common dissociation people usually do is driving somewhere and not remembering the trip. You may have dissociated the experience, but you were still present and you still engaged in the activities that it took to get where you were going. So he's saying it's the self that gets dissociated, which is interesting because he's not denying or rejecting a sense of self. There is one. It only goes unnoticed in all the confusion. It needs attention and development. Needs have to be separated from wants, and the person has to see themselves as effective in having their needs met. And because someone doesn't have that, he's saying that results in a person missing different parts of their experience at different times, having an unreliable sense of their own history. Now, I've given a more thorough picture of the sense of self than either Mears or Zinker, but let me show you the explanatory power that you get putting both of their ideas together with my own. So I'm saying personality is having a consistent sense of your trajectory, an orientation in your present situation that tells you where you're coming from and where you're going to. With all that as background, I may be able to explain these 8 things relatively easily, just apply the theory. And the first 2 are very general and a bit obvious given what we've talked about. So, unpredictable behavior. Here, a person starts to see a pattern that you don't see and starts to respond to that rather than the situation as you see it, or even as they see it in the future, or in a way that's different than they predicted they would. Whether they're correct or incorrect is irrelevant to the idea of prediction, although it is an important contribution to their personal growth. But if they can't ground their experiences on a sense of self, then how can they predict their response? And that'll make it harder for you to predict as well. Although I think if you can start seeing how this theory plays itself out in the real world, it'll become easier for anyone to predict. This is why they might be accused of being hypersensitive. Really, that's just the recognition of the beginning of some pattern and putting it together with one of the alarm bells that's already going off. Oh no, this must be this very important situation that's going on. That's what my alarm bells are telling me. And they can't just ignore it. The alarm bells are there for a reason. They were probably created for a reason. The alarms protect them. But again, like Flanders' house in The Simpsons, we need to build new supports before we can just get rid of some post that happens to be in the way. And if something happens that seems crazy, I hope you can sit down and work with these ideas, because I really think you'll be able to find some explanation here somewhere as to why anything has happened, and more importantly, how to learn from it. It should seem pretty obvious, but you have to know why alarms are going off before you can stop them from going off. And in that understanding is buried part of their sense of self. Rescuing a little part of that sense of self is vital in helping them develop a coherent sense of their whole self. If a person feels incomplete, drawing their attention to the times when they do feel whole is very important. Knowing when you play the notes right is part of learning how to play the piano. You don't move through the learning process unless you recognize good performance, not just always having your errors pointed out by other people or yourself. So that's exactly what they need to be learning, but to expect them to have mastered it, it's unrealistic without practice. Let me also point out that if you've never had a good sense of self, then the times when you do have one pop out, when you uncover it, when you unearth it or dig it up, then you won't even know what it is. So it's very important that someone pay attention to the times when they are able to predict their needs and responses and hold to those by setting appropriate boundaries, especially in the face of social pressures. But we'll come back to boundaries in a second. Now, in the cases where they're misperceiving something, it's probably because there's a gap in the pattern. They're literally dissociating part of the experience that they need to understand what's going on. Something important is missing. And to go back to my last video, this is why I hate it when emotions are treated as if you're wrangling children. Because 9 times out of 10, I bet that's where the useful information is hiding. It may be direct, like I should trust my gut feeling, or it could be self-referential, like feelings of worthlessness that I'm always fighting in myself. And then if you say something that just happens to match that pattern in my own thoughts, suddenly I see you making the arguments I make against myself. And now I'm fighting both you and me. And that's a pretty big task. Also, the emotional information could be indirect, such as, I'm feeling this because I never know how to deal with these situations and I need to see someone do it successfully so I can learn how myself. Or perhaps have a professional introduce a new skill and help me practice it. Which brings us to number 2. Sometimes a person can't focus on one problem because of the nature of associative learning. This is something everyone does, but most of the time it's invisible. And I know this is one that frustrates a lot of therapists. You try to help a person in a crisis try to put out the one fire that's going on right now, and they can't stick with that one subject. It seems like they keep getting distracted by previous situations that don't seem related at all. There's no way for them to tell the story or even explain the problem sometimes in a logical, linear fashion. But again, it's because it's not a left brain issue. It's a right brain issue. They're looking at the current pattern and trying to reach back into their history and find something similar. They're looking for some lesson that they've learned that they can apply now. But if everything they have is open, if none of it's ever gotten closure, if they've never felt like they learned anything from their history or learned contradictory things, then you may have this flight of ideas that's really following the emotional content. This emotion feels like this other emotion rather than the logical, linear, or chronological content. But remember, that's because emotions are pattern recognition. They're really saying this pattern is like another pattern I've experienced, and that didn't work out either. If you ever notice this, what you're probably seeing is someone grasping at straws, trying to get life lessons out of incomplete stories, which is exactly what does happen if your most important memories don't have closure. If they're particularly poetic or artistic, you may have even heard this yourself. Some borderlines will explain that their experience is something like being on an eternal quest to find or learn something that will help them create themselves, something important to create some inner peace. Of course, sometimes they will externalize and assume that there's something in the real world that they need to get or have to have. Car, house, girlfriend, boyfriend, money, or drugs if they start down the path of addiction. But none of that will work long term. Not even those things that seem like they should be good and meaningful relationships, like having a child. You can't win internal battles by fighting them externally. But every negative has a positive. In some ways, externalization helps, because at least it makes the goal tangible and measurable. Often it's painful just to feel like the goal is fuzzy and ill-defined. So I suppose perhaps we should try to work on that. If I might make a suggestion, think here like the behaviorists do. If you want to stop one behavior, you usually have to introduce another behavior. If I want to stop this emotional flight of ideas, I need to introduce another pattern and a replacement emotion. In fact, a whole replacement story to provide some trajectory. On the positive side, their story can start now. They can tell themselves a narrative of where they've been and where they're going and how this situation is going to work. And as they see this being successful and start to trust themselves, that will become a sense of self. And the wonderful thing about that is, having a sense of self now can help one retroactively apply the lessons they have learned. Just like a fairy tale needs the moral you take away from it, this provides the beginning, middle, and end, which is exactly what's needed to get closure to experiences that didn't make sense at the time. So what about the black and white thinking and sometimes the sudden shifts that occur with that? Well, there are two different explanations for this one. First, there's a high correlation between borderline personality disorder and trauma, so it may not necessarily be their diagnosis, but there's a lot of similarity to that behavior pattern. In a trauma or a crisis situation, you really only have two things that you need to think about. What's going to keep me alive or what's going to injure me or possibly kill me? And everything gets sorted into one of those two boxes. In fact, things that are just a distraction may actually get me killed, and they will often be put in the dangerous box. So if for some reason I start seeing that pattern and sorting things in that way, I'm obviously going to have some emotional reactions. I may suddenly have my attention drawn to these alarm bells that I have from my past that have just never been turned off. They're always ringing, and then suddenly I'm responding to them as if this is the same crisis as that was. And this can be the same thing that happens when they idealize or think someone is absolutely horrible. You're either putting them in the box that is going to save your life, and therefore they are the rescuer and the hero, or you're putting them in the risk your life box, where they are the danger and the poison. But don't think of this as a disorder. This is an out-of-context skill. If you were living in some really dangerous area, say a war zone, that skill could save your life on a daily basis. But as with everything, a skill is only a skill if it's in the correct context. If you're doing it out of that context, it's just going to get in the way and cause problems. So our intention as we go along will be to recognize differences in these patterns so that we start to recognize these two contexts as separate patterns and thus have separate emotional responses from them. Now, the second reason for black and white thinking, splitting, whatever you want to call it, extremely different ways of seeing the exact same situation at different times, well, this one's much more theoretical, but it's got such a great practical application. And I promise this will be the last theory, and then we'll kind of sprint to the end because the rest aren't too difficult to deal with. Sorry to keep having to go back and reviewing things, but remember how our sense of self was made up of our experiences wanting, getting, using, and finishing our contact with anything, and how we use that pattern to interpret the past and predict the future. Now, we talked about what can happen when a person dissociates or loses part of that pattern, such as the completion part of the pattern, and someone who never has this may always feel hungry even when they've eaten because they can't turn the alarm bells off anymore. So we had talked about this pattern of missing completion with my sense of love, and what if I end up getting in a cycle of going back to try to get affection from a parent who won't give me affection, and how that becomes self-destructive. But it can be even more than that. And in borderlines particularly, if they're missing this part of their self, that becomes how they interpret the future and the past, as I said. But see what this means. If I can't be loved now, then that must mean I was never able to be loved and never experienced real love. And in the future, I'm never going to be someone who is capable of being loved. I will never have that experience. And suddenly the entire world seems dark and drastic. And not only may I start to make incorrect decisions, but those emotions and then the actions I take on those emotions may further my dissociation and further my inability to feel loved, creating a downward spiral that's beyond my control unless a new pattern starts to emerge all on its own. Not to mention how frustrating it is for the people who actually do love us. It doesn't matter how much convincing they try to do. If they're dissociating from the experience of being loved, you're never going to convince them that they are loved. If the problem is that I'm dissociated from experiencing the completed picture of love, then I can't be convinced at that moment. We'll have to wait for a different one, which is also the point because crises are never fixed when they're happening. They're only survived. But that's an entirely different phenomenon that I don't want to get into now, but it ranges the entire experience of the circle of poverty to the circle of violence to drug addiction. The point is, You survive a fight. You don't fix problems while you're fighting. You will probably never solve an interpersonal argument while it's going on. You will prevent it from happening again once it's over. And if it's already become a big downward cycle, you don't try to prevent it all. You find the smallest reasonable steps you can take and make sure you do those. And you should expect it to happen again, but expect it to also be less severe. Baby steps are the way everything gets better. You slowly grind away at it because there is no magic wand. So don't try to solve it, try to survive, and then have a conversation when everyone is calm. And to bring this back to our dissociated sense of being loved, you can start resolving the sense of love when it's not entirely dissociated. Now, on the other hand, what if the pattern changes a little bit? And now completion is there, but now I can't see the want in the first place. Since I'm full, since I don't have the current need for food or love or whatever it may be, then that becomes the way I see my history. I must have always been loved, or if I wasn't, then it doesn't matter anymore. It's fine. It's all solved. And then I project that into my future. I'm always going to be loved. I'm always going to feel like this. And it's an unrealistic version of what's really going on because it denies the need in the first place. And then when that pattern shifts negatively again, well then, it was all a lie, wasn't it? And just like I was saying about the arguments, negative experiences are resolved when a person is having positive experiences. Remembering that sense of want and desperation when you're feeling loved begins to break that cycle because it recognizes that you accomplished something. Of course, it would be overly simplistic to say those are the only two things that get dissociated. This is just one example. But similarly, I've always thought that therapists, when they're put up on a pedestal, should hack away at that pedestal. When they think you're perfect, then point out your humanity so that they can connect those two different sides. That may be your only chance because when you're the devil, it's a little harder and self-serving to say, yes, people do make mistakes, because that's exactly what the devil would do. Although if you've already had a discussion about how those perceptions may shift, then you might be able to remind them of previous perceptions. But dissociating any part of your experience is going to create problems. If you have one part of your pattern missing, you can't see the whole picture of your life and you can never properly adjust. Again, the point is helping the person get a story where they can see the whole picture at one time. This actually can explain why almost everybody has trouble sticking to decisions. When we make decisions, oftentimes we don't consider the opposite side. We want to convince ourselves to do something good, so we forget about how much we enjoy the bad parts. Or perhaps we want to get out of a negative relationship, and so we only think about the negative things that person brought into our lives. If we do that, we're not making a full decision. That decision will involve sacrifice. And if we don't look at the thing to be sacrificed, the good things we get out of the relationship, we can't make that decision. Having closure and completion on that decision means you have to understand the entire context. And you can't do that while dissociating parts of it. So the rest of these should come together relatively easily. Like personal boundaries, either being too rigid or being too open. But it really makes perfect sense if you go back to the two boxes of this will help me survive or this will kill me. Things that are in the survival box, if they're having a good pattern, then everything is fine. There's no need to have boundaries. Obviously, that's unrealistic because boundaries prevent you from becoming unsafe rather than keep you safe once you're already in danger. And on the flip side, a situation that is only mildly uncomfortable may seem life-threatening, and then you end up yelling at some random bag boy at the checkout line and feel embarrassed about it later. Don't feel embarrassed. Just look at the pattern of threat and make sure you can recognize it again in the future. Learning from the situation gives you closure. There are a lot more options to respond with an appropriate amount of force because that bag boy wouldn't threaten anybody. He's only like 120 pounds. He couldn't take anything. I've been debating for a little while whether I should go into some other ideas here. I have like at least two other theories that can apply. I'll just be very short. There are three kinds of borderline, and I'll describe them here in a second, but don't consider these hard and fast lines that can't be crossed. It's just a general idea. It's mainly supposed to be practical so you can easily assess which of the three kinds of borderline you might be working with and then make a half-decent guess about what kind of boundary issues they may have. The first part isn't mine. It's Fritz Perl's response to Sigmund Freud. The idea there being the skin as a metaphor, being unable to naturally chew up and digest the world as it's supposed to. The lack of self creates a skin that's either too thin and everything comes in and becomes toxic because I can't regulate my own system, or I'm too far away from people and I can't let them in at all. And when I do, I freak out about it. Those two are the extremes, and then the third type is in the middle. Basically, these are just coping or relationship management skills. The person copes by bringing people in too close, or maybe pushing them too far away, or just not knowing how to manage them in general. An extra layer of problem is developed when they start saying, well, that's just the way I am, and thinking of it as an identity rather than just, this is what I do. When it's an identity, it's much harder to correct. This goes right back to what I was just saying about not being able to sort out what's dangerous versus helpful all the time, because the two boxes are just too rigid, and sometimes things are partially dangerous or partially helpful or just useless. In the future, I'll post a video on 3 different archetypes of borderline personality disorder and how each of those has difficulty managing personal boundaries and how they develop relationships. But it would take a little bit too long at the moment, so we'll just move on. Number 5 is mentalization. I use that word because it's a bit unfamiliar, but it's also the name of one of the therapies that has been shown to be effective with borderline personality disorder, mentalization-based therapy. Mentalization here means the general ability of mind reading, not talking about psychics, just talking about understanding what's going on in someone else's mind. This is part of the reason that I've speculated about autism being an overpowered left hemisphere and borderline being an overpowered right hemisphere. The statement about autistics there is evidenced by the work of Simon Baron-Cohen from Cambridge University, who's actually the brother of the actor. I think it's Sacha Baron Cohen. As for the application to an overactive right hemisphere to borderline personality, Mears has a little bit of this in him, but mainly I'm going to say this is my own speculation. I'll overstate my case just for clarity, but the idea here is that people with autism wouldn't have access to social patterns, and borderlines would have access to far too many to sort out. So mentalization would have type 1 and type 2 errors, meaning I either assume that they're thinking something that they're not, or they are thinking something that I can't pick up on. Probably because there's too much noise in my mind from too many patterns. But this really becomes obvious based on what we've already said. With an inconsistent or dissociated sense of self, how am I going to sort out my own experiences, much less figure out what's going on in someone else's mind? In fact, part of the patterns that I'm seeing from my life are going to be assumed to be part of their patterns too. Obviously, that's how projection happens, and that's how I end up fighting fights with them that I'm really having with myself. This really goes hand in hand with DBT's interpersonal effectiveness skills. But sorting out the errors in my pattern recognition when I'm interacting with other people is one of the biggest challenges, because they become the background to my experience. And this goes for any kind of projection, transference, countertransference. Anybody can have these experiences. To go back to a bit of Gestalt, here's a picture of you and your environment. Figure, you, and ground, the place you are. The picture's supposed to look like this, and here the beach could be anyone you're interacting with, the setting, everything going on around you, including the things you need and how you think you can get the things you need. But to interpret the world around me, I need to know something about myself, to know what it means. If I'm big and strong, then things in the world may not be as dangerous. If I'm small and weak, then the same things may be very dangerous. So this fuzzy sense of self can get projected outwards into a fuzzy sense of the environment, and not understanding the environment plays back on me again, until everything's fuzzy. This is one of the problems in mentalization. If I can't figure out what you're thinking because I'm missing pieces of the picture, then I also can't figure out where I am or what I should be doing or who I am. And that directly affects my self-perception. And if I'm in that pattern of perceiving things as a danger, then all of these things are harsh and bright and seem to be attacking me. And I can't make out what's going on well enough to know where the danger's coming from. When everything gets really fuzzy like this, it can be overwhelming or numbing, one of the two. Either way, my main need is to find some kind of grounding, some reference point to help orient me to get my bearings, but everywhere I look, it's all fuzzy nonsense. And this brings us to number 6, suicidality and self-harm. Sometimes the uncertainty about knowing how the story ends may make you want to make the story end. But often that's just the escape hatch that's used to make sure there's some hope to finally make some sense out of the suffering. So whether it's feeling things too much or not feeling things at all, either way, the person is trapped in that right hemisphere, that pattern recognition, those emotions or lack of emotions, and the undeniability of pain presents one kind of grounding that lets them orient themselves in the world. The endorphins from the experience pull them out of the right hemisphere and into the lower brain, actually make them connect again with their body. These are the kind of skills that are also worked out in DBT. You can learn to have the same effects without actually hurting yourself. And you can learn how to not need to do that. Some examples are like holding some ice, doing other kinds of exercises or activities that bring you back into your body will pull you out of that way of thinking. It's a very helpful set of skills to work on. But self-harm is a way to know where the danger is, and often cutting is even a way to see that story that I've been talking about, the beginning of an injury, the healing process, and sometimes it's the only way a person feels they have permission to take care of themselves. Or it's the suffering they feel is required for them to get love, but that opens up a much bigger discussion, so we'll move on. But this does go directly into problem number 7, the intentional creation of chaos, or some reasonable facsimile thereof. But if you expect that the world is a dangerous place, and that bad things are going to be happening, then isn't it better to know where the danger is and to know where those bad things are? If I create a fight between those people over there, then at least I know where the danger is, and other people are going to be distracted and drawn towards that and leave me alone. This can be both safety for me as well as have secondary gains of some kind. Meaning, if I get my two enemies to fight with each other, or if I destabilize one of them, then perhaps that makes me safer. Or if I have two friends that I'm worried may abandon me, if I get them to fight with each other, then I may be the only person they have left, as long as they don't notice that I did it. It certainly may not be the best approach, but you have to admit that it is an approach to fulfill some needs. If we want a person to stop doing this, then we have to give them the skills to not have to do this. Most people don't have to accomplish these goals in this way, so they don't. But if it's the only way a person knows how to, then I think most people probably would. And that brings me to the last of the problems. It's what Marshall Leinen refers to as the apparent competence of the person, and Sanson and Levitt refer to as the socially intact facade. I saved this one for last because it's very problematic to even talk about. And the reason I say so is it's absolutely necessary to understand this when you're dealing with a borderline person, because it increases your ability to perceive what's going on. But at the same time, it has a judgmental edge to it, whether they noticed it or not. The idea of apparent competence kind of assumes incompetence, and the idea of a socially intact facade means that it's something fake on the outside. This is not a strength-based approach to dealing with borderlines. The real point should be to focus on the strengths that are actually stated there and say, how do we build up a solid structure inside that facade to make it real, to make it durable? How do we take the parts of the competence that are visible and are there and expand them into other areas? But first, I'll need to explain what this means because it's very important you don't overlook it. I believe Marshall Leinen was the first person to describe this, and she called it apparent competence. She provides a story with an example, and I feel like I've described this before, but I'm going to have to go through it again if I have. She was doing work with a client who seemed very professional and capable within her area of expertise, and I don't remember the exact details, but this woman was having difficulty approaching her boss about some particular problem. Over the course of several sessions, Linehan had attempted to help this woman work through the reasons and barriers that were keeping her from addressing this problem, but it never seemed to be effective. Every time she would come back and say, no, I still haven't addressed it. Finally, Linehan decided to do some therapeutic role play and said, you're going to be your boss and I'm going to be you, and we're going to see what kind of objections you think your boss will have when you attempt to address this problem. I like this particular intervention because it works two different areas. It works mentalization. She's able to think through what her boss may believe while also seeing a role model example of how she could interact with her boss. And so they talked it out, and the client was immediately able to go back and engage with her boss appropriately. There's a lot to learn from this story in that we can perfectly see how a dissociated self works. There were some areas in which this client was very skillful and very capable of arranging her life and managing the difficulties that she was having. But then there were other areas that seemed like she needed significant skill work. And the tricky part was that because Linehan had seen this woman be able to perform well in some areas, she assumed she would have the skills to be able to perform in this particular area. But as I mentioned in the section on associative learning, because you have a skill in one area doesn't mean it transfers. These things are blocked off and can even be blocked off by mood. If I don't feel the same in one situation as I do another, maybe I'm supposed to react to them differently. I dissociate one way of being from another way of being because I don't feel like they're consistent and I don't feel like they work in the same situations. And again, sometimes that could even be a survival skill. If my dad comes home drunk and I feel fear, then I need to act one certain way. But the skills that work in that situation may not work in a situation when he comes home happy and he's not drunk. But what if in the situation where he is drunk, my mom always stays quiet, but when he's not drunk, she's brave and bitter, and she's emotionally abusive to him and me? Obviously, I'm making a contrived situation to explain it, but you could see how this could tear somebody into pieces. Maybe I have to be quiet in one situation so I don't get beat up, but in the other situation I have to be loud and defend myself, otherwise I get torn down. If drunk dad means that I have to be scared of him physically, but sober dad means I have to be afraid of my mother emotionally, then I have to learn two entirely different ways of being. Get the picture? How exactly do I ever know who I am? That's an example of how they may deal with all their problems, compartmentalized and arranged in associative contexts of emotional connectivity. Meaning, when I'm in this particular mood or have these particular emotions, then I have access to these skills. But in another setting, in another context, I may have learned that those skills will get me in trouble and are scary, and therefore I can't perform them. Again, I want to normalize here. To some extent, we're all like this. And therefore, I hope you can get some intuitive sense as to why this might happen and how to better predict interactions with borderline people. Okay, so now that we've defined the self as a sense of a consistent pattern of living across the lifespan that allows you to get access to the things you need and exert some power and influence on the world, the other question was, how do you fix it if it's broken? Some of that I think I've answered along the way as we just get a concept of what this is supposed to be, how one would find closure, how you would be able to recognize a sense of self when you see it. Some of this may require a little bit more direct action and intervention planning than I've given you so far, So I'm going to get into that in my next video. Also, I think I'm going to try to take all the short little ideas and release each one of those as bite-sized nugget videos, mainly so that they can be more digestible, but also because it may just be easier for me to do. My concern is you won't hear how well they fit together like you do if they're all put into one video, but at the same time, I worry that I throw too much at you at one time and then you're really going to catch none of it. Hopefully the short videos you could watch over and over as you need, and maybe it would be easier to retain and practice those ideas. As always, I'd love to hear comments and questions. I try to get into long discussions on my Minds.com account, and if you'd like to gab me, that's cool too. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. But mainly, I'd love it if you shared this video with someone who could use it.